Guten Tag, meine Damen und Herren, und willkommen zurück. Das ist die 28. Lektion in unserer Reise durch die deutsche Sprache. Jetzt aber kommen wir sofort zur Sache. Remember that we ended our last lesson with the following grammar challenge. Based on how English changes grammatical tense in its passive constructions, how do you think German does this? For instance, if someone asked us to describe what's happening in this picture, we might say, a suspected thief is getting or being interrogated by two policemen. This sentence is in the present tense passive voice. But if we were asked to describe what happened in the past tense, we would then say, a suspected thief was or got interrogated by two policemen. In other words, in English, we change the auxiliary verb to be or to get to its simple past form, was or got. And in fact, something very similar happens in German. Namely, we put the auxiliary verb werden into its simple past form, wurden. So, to come back to our interrogated suspected thief picture, if someone asked us in the present tense, was passiert hier? Our answer would go, ein mutmaßlicher Dieb wird von zwei Polizisten verhört. But if we were asked the same question in the simple past tense, was passierte in diesem Bild? Our response would be the exact same, except for one word. Ein mutmaßlicher Dieb wurde von zwei Polizisten verhört. As we can see, the only thing that changes is our helping verb, which goes from wird in the present to wurde in the past tense. Keep in mind, too, that wird and wurde are the conjugated forms of werden and wurden. Regardless of tense, we still have to conjugate the helping verb with the subject. Oh, and do you remember our adorable dog washing picture? The one with the kids? Well, in response to the question, was passierte hier? We would now say, der Hund wurde von den Kindern gewaschen. Und das, meine Damen und Herren, ist alles. This is how you express the passive voice in the simple past tense. Ziemlich einfach, oder? Also dann, the time has now come for us to add one last, but one very important arrow to our quiver of German grammar skills, if you'll forgive the misbegotten metaphors. In what follows from this point on, we are going to dedicate our attention to the third and final grammatical mood in German. Recall that so far, we've learned both the indicative and the imperative moods. Well, in what follows, we are going to add a third mood to this list, namely the subjunctive. Aber bitte, haben Sie keine Angst. Ich habe einen wasserdichten Plan für uns. It just so happens that a pair of familiar faces has agreed to stop by and showcase for us the basics of how the subjunctive mood works in everyday German conversation. Na ja, raten Sie mal, wer diese Leute sind. Genau, Ralf und Mia Gruber. And here's what's going on. Ralf is, well, he's dealing with a personal trauma of sorts. You see, he recently upgraded to a smartphone and, like most of us, he's struggling to figure out how to use it. Kommt das Ihnen bekannt vor? Also dann, meine Damen und Herren, let's listen in now as Ralph attempts to work out his technological trauma with the help of his ever-reliable life partner, Mia.
Ach, komm schon. So schwer kann es doch nicht sein.
Na, wie geht's mit dem neuen, hochmodernen Smartphone?
Wenn ich nur so smart wäre wie dieses Gerät.
Was ist los?
Ich versuche, den Klingelton festzulegen.
Hast du im Benutzerhandbuch nachgeschaut?
Ach, wer liest denn heutzutage das Benutzerhandbuch?
Naja, diejenigen, die ihr neues Smartphone eigentlich benutzen wollten.
Ach, Mist. Ich geb's auf. Was ist denn so witzig?
Nichts.
Doch, sonst würdest du nicht kichern.
Ich finde nur, es wäre schön, wenn du das teure Teil auch benutzen könntest.
Wenn es ein Easyphone gäbe, würde ich das viel lieber als ein sogenanntes Smartphone nehmen.
Tja, sowas gibt es leider nicht.
Darum sage ich das im Konjunktiv, wenn es ein Easyphone gäbe.
Aber Ralf, wenn du ein Easyphone hättest, dürftest du nicht mehr prahlen.
Wenigstens müsste ich kein Benutzerhandbuch lesen.
Ja, wenn wir alle nur so smart wären wie Ralf Gruber.
Ach, du meine Güte. You know, between you and me, I think I agree with Ralph. Ich würde auch viel lieber ein Easyphone nehmen. Aber gut, meine Damen und Herren, as always, Ralph and me's dialogue wasn't just dramatisch. It was also filled with wonderfully authentic examples of the subjunctive mood. Let's take a look at some of them now, shall we? We'll start with this little exchange. This is a point where Ralph gets so frustrated with his new smartphone that he gives up and exclaims, Ach, Mist, ich geb's auf. His wife's response to this is to chuckle, Mia kichert. And so Ralph asks her, Was ist denn so witzig? Now, at first she demurs, claiming that it's nichts. But Ralph isn't so easily put off, and he insists, Doch. And at this point, something happens. Ralph's mood changes. Now, not his psychological disposition, I'm talking about his grammatical mood. Because his next sentence is no longer in the indicative, but rather in the subjunctive. He says, Sonst würdest du nicht kichern. Ralph, you see, isn't expressing the action of chuckling, kichern, in factual or this is real terms. I mean, he's not saying, otherwise you aren't chuckling. Instead, he's framing the action in contrary to fact or hypothetical terms. Because, well, Mia is chuckling, but she's denying that she finds anything funny. Yet Ralph insists that she does, in fact, find something funny. Otherwise, he says, you wouldn't be chuckling. This statement is contrary to fact or hypothetical because, well, Mia is indeed chuckling. Get it? The main point here is this. When we want to express ourselves in German in contrary to fact or hypothetical terms, we use the subjunctive mood. Here's what I mean. The indicative mood expresses factual, this is how things are or things were information. Ich kichere, wenn ich etwas witzig finde. The subjunctive mood, on the other hand, expresses contrary to fact or hypothetical information. Ich würde kichern, wenn ich das witzig finden würde. This is actually what we're going to call the würden plus infinitive subjunctive construction. It's a common and particularly useful way of expressing contrary to fact or hypothetical information. Speakers of German use it in everyday conversation as well as in informal styles of writing, like personal emails, instant messaging, or in informal cards or letters. So let's take a look at one more example of this würden plus infinitive subjunctive from Ralph and Mia's dialogue. Actually, it's Ralph's quote-unquote confession, where he tells Mia the following. Wenn es ein Easyphone gäbe, würde ich das viel lieber als ein sogenanntes Smartphone nehmen. Once again, note that Ralph is not speaking in realistic terms. There is, sadly, no such thing as an Easyphone. So, Ralph's language wades into the realm of the hypothetical. He is saying that if there was or were such a thing as an Easyphone, he would take one of those over his snazzy but complicated smartphone. And the way that he expresses this hypotheticalness is by using würden as a modal verb. Ralph conjugates würden with his subject, ich. He leaves his main verb nehmen in its infinitive form, and then he moves this infinitive to the end of the sentence. And voila! Ralph has now expressed himself in the subjunctive. Now, as I already mentioned, this is how millions of Germans express themselves in the subjunctive mood in day-to-day conversations. The würden plus Infinitiv subjunctive works with any German verb. Although, as we'll get to in just a moment, speakers often do something different when they express the verbs sein, haben, geben, wissen, brauchen, and the modal verbs in the subjunctive. But aside from these, any German verb is fair game for the würden plus Infinitiv construction. Zum Beispiel. Let's say that you're interested in buying a new laptop, but you're hesitant to do so because, well, you feel that they just cost too much. Imagine that. And so, when a friend asks you, wann kaufst du endlich ein neues Notebook? Your answer would go, ich würde ein neues Notebook kaufen, wenn es nicht so viel kosten würde. Or imagine this horrific scenario. Your computer at work has died. Ach, wie schade. In fact, it turns out that die Festplatte ist kaputt. Even worse, you've been waiting for hours for those IT people to come and fix it. But then, things get even worse than this. Because while you're waiting for your Festplatte to get repariert, a colleague texts you and is asking about, oh, where's that new Anwendung? And it's the new Anwendung that you were supposed to have tested, saved, and uploaded for her to work on later. And so this is what you text your colleague back. Wenn die IT-Leute endlich kommen und meine kaputte Festplatte reparieren würden, würde ich die neue Anwendung testen, speichern und hochladen. Okay, I'll admit as much. If you don't work in the IT-Bereich, this scenario might be a little hard to swallow, but the larger linguistic lesson still applies. Namely, the würden plus Infinitiv subjunctive can be used to describe all sorts of real-world situations and professional annoyances. Gut, meine Damen und Herren, our quiver of linguistic skills is getting fuller and fuller. We can now express ourselves in not just one, not just two, but in 3 grammatical moods. And now comes the part where I tell you that even though millions of German native speakers use this würden plus Infinitiv in their daily interactions, and without thinking twice, this construction is not the only way to express contrary to fact or hypothetical conditions. In fact, this other construction that I'm referring to, it doesn't require a form of würden at all, let alone in infinitiv. Instead, speakers can derive a single subjunctive form from the verb itself, what we're going to call the single verb subjunctive. Und wissen Sie was? It just so happens that our very own Ralf und Mia Gruber use a few of these single verb subjunctives in their dialogue. So ein Zufall, oder? So then, meine Damen und Herren, let us now take a closer look at these riveting single verb subjunctive forms, shall we? The first example comes near the start of their conversation, when Ralph is battling with his new smartphone. Mia asks him, Na, wie geht's mit dem neuen Smartphone? And Ralph, who's clearly frustrated with the device, exclaims, Wenn ich nur so smart wäre wie dieses Gerät. Now, this is a perfect illustration of how the subjunctive works in what we call wenn nur exclamations. Wenn nur exclamations are used to express a wish or a desire in the sense that there's something wanted which is not present. Now, in Ralph's case, he's wishing that he were as smart as his snazzy new smartphone. And in fact, he could also say the following. Ich wünschte, ich wäre so smart wie dieses Gerät. The wäre here is the single verb subjunctive form of the infinitive verb sein. To derive this single verb subjunctive form, we start with the third person singular simple past form of the verb, which for sein would be this. Sie es war. Then, because the vowels A, O, and U almost always take a vowel change in the subjunctive, we add an umlaut to the simple past form to get wer. This is now our single verb subjunctive stem. But we're not done yet, right? We still have to conjugate this single verb subjunctive stem with the subject. Thus, here's what the conjugational endings look like for single verb subjunctive stems. We'll use these endings to conjugate the subjunctive form of the verb sein. Are you ready? For the first person singular ich and for the third person singular er, sie, es pronouns, we add an I. Ich wäre, er, sie, es wäre. For second person singular du, we add est. Du wärest. For second person plural ihr, we add et. Ihr wäret. And for all other pronouns, sie, and wir, conjugational ending is in. Sie wären, wir wären. This, then, is how Ralph constructs his wishful wenn nur utterance as follows. Wenn ich nur so smart wäre wie dieses Gerät. By the way, when I teach these wenn nur constructions to my students, I affectionately refer to it as the if I only had a brain subjunctive. Anyway, let's take a look at a few more examples of the if I only had a brain subjunctive. And as we go through them, I'd like you to try and figure out the indicative form from which the single verb subjunctive derives. Alles klar? Super. Also dann, here is our first if I only had a brain subjunctive sentence. Wenn ich nur eine Bluetooth-Freisprechanlage im Auto hätte. The subjunctive verb hätte comes from the indicative haben. You derive it by, first, putting haben into its third person simple past form, hatte. Second, adding an umlaut to the stem to get het. And third, conjugating it for ich hätte. Wenn ich nur eine Bluetooth-Freisprechanlage im Auto hätte. Alrighty then. Here's our next wenn nur exclamation. Wenn es hier nur eine drahtlose Internetverbindung gäbe. Allow me to squeeze in just a little footnote here, okay? Instead of this long compound, drahtlose Internetverbindung or drahtloser Internetzugang, speakers often just use the term WLAN, which actually comes from the English wireless local area network. WLAN. Gut, and now back to our wenn nur exclamation. The single verb subjunctive here is gäbe. It comes from the infinitive verb geben. Again, we take this verb's third person simple past form, gab, then we umlaut the vowel to get gäb, and last, we conjugate it. Ich gäbe, du gäbest, sie es gäbe. Wenn es hier nur eine drahtlose Internetverbindung gäbe. While the indicative phrase es gibt means there is or there are, in the subjunctive mood, es gäbe translates to there were. Schön. Meine Damen und Herren, let's look at just one last wenn nur subjunctive. How about this one? Wenn wir nur wüssten, wie wir den Font fettdrucken könnten. In this sentence, we actually have two single verb subjunctives. There's wüssten and there's könnten. Wüssten comes from wissen, whose third person simple past form is wusste, to which we add an umlaut to get the stem wüsst, and which we conjugate for the pronoun wir. Wir wüssten. The second verb, könnten, comes from the modal verb können, Whereas können means to be able to or can, its subjunctive form, könnten, means were able to, could. To derive this form, we put können into its third-person simple past form, konnte. We umlaut the O to get the stem könnt, and we conjugate this stem for wir. Wir könnten. Und das ist alles. This is how wenn-nur exclamations work in German, using the single verb present subjunctive. Now, here's the deal with the single verb subjunctive in German. Just as we learned for the simple past tense, the single verb subjunctive is generally restricted to writing and a formal speech. What I mean is, speakers don't usually use it in casual conversation. You know, in their day-to-day verbal interactions. There, Germans prefer to use the würde plus infinitive construction that we learned earlier in this lesson. For instance, speakers will almost always prefer to say, ich würde lieber nach Wien fahren, or was würdest du tun, wenn ich die ganze Flasche Wein trinken würde? Than to use single verb subjunctives and say this, ich führe lieber nach Wien. Was tätest du, wenn ich die ganze Flasche Wein tränke? Ach, you know, even saying those last two sentences kind of makes me shudder. To a native speaker's ear, it would sound something like this. Were it to be left to my discretion, I should like to imbibe the entire contents of yonder carafe of vino. Instead of just saying, if I wanted to, I could drink that whole jar of wine. Get it? Now, that said, there are a few notable exceptions to the general rule of the single verb subjunctive being only used in writing or formal speech. And these exceptions are the verbs sein, haben, geben, wissen, and brauchen, and all the modal verbs. For whatever reason, even in everyday conversation, speakers often do express these verbs in the single verb subjunctive form. To see what I mean, let's go back to and take a closer look at the last few lines of the Gruber's dialogue. It's when Mia tells Ralph this. Ich finde nur, es wäre schön, wenn du das teure Teil auch benutzen könntest. Now, it's a playful little poke at Ralph, one which he seems to ignore, though, because he then goes on to muse, wenn es ein Easyphone gäbe, würde ich das viel lieber als ein sogenanntes Smartphone nehmen. Naja, quite a profound statement, although it does give Mia yet another opportunity to tease her beloved life partner, because she then says, aber Ralf, wenn du ein Easyphone hättest, dürftest du nicht mehr prahlen. Actually, that's a pretty good comeback, right? But if you think this jab will finally get under Ralph's skin, da liegst du falsch. You see, when you've been married for a certain number of years, you learn the art of selektives Hören. And accordingly, Ralph simply sidesteps the jab and says this to Mia. Wenigstens müsste ich kein Benutzerhandbuch lesen. Now, at this point, Mia basically relents. I mean, it's clear that none of her razzing is going to get under Ralph's skin. And so, she decides to end the conversation with a sigh and the following comment, which might be more to herself than to Ralph. Ja, wenn wir alle nur so smart wären wie Ralf Gruber. Also dann, meine Damen und Herren, let's sum all of this up one last time before we bid each other auf Wiedersehen und bis gleich. We've seen that the verbs sein, haben, geben, wissen, and brauchen are commonly used in German in their single verb subjunctive forms, and especially in spoken German. In other words, speakers do not use würden with the verb's infinitive form and then move this infinitive to the end of the sentence, as in, an deiner Stelle würde ich diesen Link nicht anklicken. Instead, if a speaker uses haben oder sein in the subjunctive, they will often say something like this. Wenn Sie eine drahtlose Tastatur hätten, wäre Ihr Schreibtisch ordentlicher. Or even something like this if they're an employee who is especially mindful about operational costs. Wenn ich nur wüsste, ob wir wirklich diese großen, teuren Bildschirme und Lautsprecher bräuchten. In addition, we've seen that in their everyday informal spoken interactions, native speakers also tend to use modal verbs in the single verb subjunctive. For example, in the following made-up and rather extensive complaint from an employee regarding the new managers. Wenn die neuen Manager wirklich wollten, dass wir mehr leisten, sollten sie endlich mal einen neuen Laserkopierer kaufen. Dann könnten wir Doku schneller kopieren und müssten nicht alle 2 Tage die IT-Leute anrufen, um das jetzige Gerät zu reparieren. Boy, that is a complaint. Did you get all that? If not, keine Panik. Remember that all of this printed stuff is going to be in your course workbook as well. However, for the sake of clarity, and because I know that my own students often need me to clarify this for them more than once, let's do a word-by-word rundown of what each modal verb means in its subjunctive form. Wunderbar. All right, here goes. Wenn du willst, if you want. Wenn du wolltest, if you wanted to. Wenn du darfst, if you're allowed to. Wenn du dürftest, if you were allowed to. Wenn du kannst, if you are able to or can. Wenn du könntest, if you were able to or could. Wenn du magst, if you like. Wenn du möchtest, if you would like to. Wenn du sollst, if you are supposed to. Wenn du solltest, if you were supposed to or ought to or should. And finally, wenn du musst, if you have to or must. Wenn du müsstest, if you had to. Phew, das hat Spaß gemacht, oder? Just remember the following main point. The indicative forms express reality and facts. Ich muss mein Zimmer aufräumen, wenn es unordentlich ist. Whereas the subjunctive forms express information that's contrary to fact, hypothetical, or wishful thinking. Ich müsste mein Zimmer aufräumen, wenn es unordentlich wäre. Nun, meine Damen und Herren, believe it or not, the time has now come for us to say goodbye. Aber seien Sie nicht traurig. We'll see each other again real soon, because in our next lesson, which will be die 29. Lektion, we're going to return to the subjunctive one more time. Specifically, we're going to learn 1, how to use a subjunctive to add an extra layer of politeness to requests, and 2, how to express something in the past tense subjunctive. Oh, and speaking of our next lesson, can you believe that it will also be our last Überlesson? Meine Güte, ich kann es kaum fassen. In our previous Überlessons, we've been to Austria, Switzerland, southern Germany, and northern Germany. And now, for our final Überlesson, we're going to accompany Ralph and Mia as they explore Eastern Germany. Das ist ein Abenteuer, das Sie nicht verpassen wollen. Also dann, meine Damen und Herren, auf Wiedersehen und bis gleich.